Today we've got a special Q&A episode. We're celebrating our 2-year anniversary of the Watchmaker's Workshop. We've got quite a few questions to go over, and hopefully I'll be able to give some really good answers. Thoughts on domed crystals. On certain watches, a domed crystal is really beautiful, but also it brings a little bit of a historic element. With a lot of the old plexi crystals, the plastic crystals, they had a dome to them, and that was for structural integrity and because the way they attach to a watch case. So they were domed just by default, but now that's kind of in our head as what a vintage watch looks like. And so that past of watchmaking, which is really what we're all looking for in a mechanical watch, that exists in a sapphire domed crystal. There's even box crystals, which are closer to what the shape of an acrylic crystal was, but made out of sapphire. Domed crystals can introduce a bit of glare, which is one downside, but they also won't flash like a flat crystal. A flat crystal will have a tendency to reflect at a certain angle and almost flash or blind you sometimes. Kind of like if you're driving and somebody has their iPhone out and it catches the sun at just the right angle and it goes into the driver's eyes. So I personally like a domed sapphire crystal because it avoids that and because of the vintage aesthetic. One thing to note with a domed sapphire crystal, you have to start with a much thicker piece of sapphire. So they can be quite a bit more expensive because you start with a thicker piece of sapphire and then you grind off the top portion and you grind off the inner portion if it's domed on the outside and domed on the inside. So it can be quite expensive. A flat sapphire crystal is going to be less expensive. I have noticed that a lot of companies stay with just a flat sapphire crystal, such as Rolex. They use a flat sapphire crystal and do not use any domed crystals. The only domed crystal is going to be on the Deep Sea Sea Dweller. Do you have plans to make a GMT or chronograph? I do have plans to make a GMT and a chronograph. Those two complications are very interesting to me. The chronograph for historical reasons. It's a very complex mechanism, and I'm particularly interested in a manual wind column wheel chronograph, something that uses a lot of traditional watchmaking. It's very complex to make, very complex to design, but I think it's something that should be kept alive because of all the history behind mechanical chronographs. On the other hand, there's a GMT, which I'm interested in purely for the use of it. The chronograph actually doesn't interest me that much as far as using it. I'm more interested in the chronograph because of the complexity of it. But with the GMT, it's a complication that I actually think is very useful. So I do have hopes that we will produce those two complications. What aspects of watchmaking do you hope to improve your ability in most? I think there's always room for improvement in anything as finely detailed as watchmaking. I also look at watchmaking as an art form. So I really don't think you can ever master an art form because the goal is constantly changing. I think just learning more every year and trying to keep the classic watchmaking and the history of it alive, making sure that that still exists when I retire from watchmaking. Do you think it would be difficult for somebody who has spent a lot of time learning from YouTube videos but has no real mechanical knowledge if they would like to become a watchmaker? I don't necessarily think that where you get the knowledge is going to affect whether you can become a good watchmaker or not. I think the real important aspect to think about is how much you are learning and actually trying to apply. There are people who could watch YouTube videos about watchmaking all day long and never put anything to practice, never try anything out, or just never get started. And you can't really learn to become a watchmaker if you don't get your hands on a set of tools and get your hands on some watch parts, read some books about watchmaking. You really have to get hands-on in order to learn about watchmaking. So I think YouTube is a great start, and then hands-on work. As a business owner making a distinctly made in USA product, how do you feel about the trade war? I'm not thrilled that there is a trade war going on right now. I don't think it's good for anyone. I think what's most important is to focus on what you are passionate about and figure out how to do it the best that you can. And it doesn't really matter what country you're in or where you're trying to sell your product or what materials you're trying to get from other countries. I believe in open economic opportunities across borders, free trade. I think that's where the most growth happens for everyone. And then a rising tide can actually lift all boats. Trying to unfairly stack odds against certain people because of where they live is not going to benefit anyone in the long term. What is your biggest challenge when designing a new watch model? I think the biggest challenge when designing anything new is simply starting. Just starting the process, taking the first steps, getting anything down on paper, getting any design into CAD. Those first steps are the toughest ones. That doesn't mean that the rest of the process is easy, but I think the main challenge lies in starting. Congratulations on the 2nd year of the channel. If you had to take just one watch on a desert island, which one would it be? Part of me says I should take the most amazing mechanical masterpiece onto a desert island. But I think it would probably be more practical to take something like a swatch. Something simple with a battery. Because I think over time, that battery's going to die and the watch is going to stop working. And if you're still on the desert island, then you probably don't need to know what time it is anymore. It's probably time to start waking up with the sun and going to sleep with the sun, and focusing on what's right in front of you, other than a wristwatch. What is the most difficult part of a watch to make? There are a few parts in a mechanical wristwatch that are very complex to make. Some for very obvious reasons, things like a balance staff because it's very tiny, or something like a hairspring because it has to be just the right coil and it has to actually pair up with a balance wheel in order to keep time. But really, I think there are a couple lesser known parts inside of a wristwatch that are very hard to manufacture. One part that is very challenging is the sliding pinion. The sliding pinion is a small pinion that goes on the winding stem of a watch, and it is what interacts with the dial side in order to set the time, but it also interacts with another wheel in order to be able to wind up the mainspring of your watch. So it slides back and forth. It has a square broached hole through it. It looks like a little pipe with a square inside. And then it has one tooth profile on the front side of it, a different tooth profile on the back side of it, and it has a groove around the outside to interact with the yoke in the setting mechanism. This part is machined on all sides. Starts from a cylinder or a bar of steel, and it's machined on every side. It has to be polished. It has 2 different tooth profiles, and there's a square broach. So it's got all the makings for an extremely hard part to make. And most people will never see one because it's hidden underneath the dial of your watch. You can't see it from the back with an exhibition case back. What differentiates levels of watchmakers skill-wise? Who do you learn from still? So in the workplace, I usually find that the older the watchmaker, the more experience they have. And that's just because they've been around more watchmakers over the years and learned from their peers. Right? There's only so much that we can learn in school. And then after that, with additional training in schools and things like that. But really, where you're going to learn the most is day in and day out next to a more experienced watchmaker, who probably is more experienced because he's had more years, or she has had more years with other more experienced watchmakers. And the knowledge is passed down from one watchmaker to the next. You may see different titles for watchmakers, right? Senior watchmakers or master watchmakers or certified in complications. There's all different types of levels. You don't necessarily have to get a specific title or a specific certificate or any kind of specific level in a certain way. I think one of the best ways to learn is actually from other watchmakers and just always having your mind open so that when someone with more experience says, maybe you should try this a different way, they probably know something that you don't. And to have an open mind and give it a try and see if it works better for you, I think that's the most important thing. The person that has an open mind like that is going to be given the most information. When a more experienced watchmaker sees that someone is actually ready to learn and listen and try the things that they suggest, well, they're going to suggest more things. If you try to teach somebody something and they don't listen the first time, chances are you're going to be less likely to chime in and give input and little tidbits of knowledge. So the person with the open mind is going to learn a lot more and progress a lot quicker. And there really isn't an end goal of learning with watchmaking. Other than Weiss watches, what is your favorite watch brand and why? My favorite brand, other than Weiss, is Audemars Piguet. And part of that has to do with the fact that I worked for them. So I personally saw inside of the company and have relationships with people who also worked for the company. So it's personal, but it's not just personal. It's an extremely old brand and still has family members, descendants of the Audemars and Piguet family, who are still working with the brand. And that's rare in the world of watchmaking. They also produce grand complications and have produced at least one grand complication every year, even in the slowest times when other brands were closing their doors and shutting down forever. So there's a lot of history in a company like Audemars Piguet. And it's still independently owned, which I think is very important in today's industry. With so many brands being purchased by groups and operated in a much different manner, I think having independent watchmaking houses is very important. What's your holy grail watch, but in the I could actually swing the price tag if I could just find it range? That's a tough question for me. I'm the kind of person that if I get focused on something and I can afford it, then I will buy it. It won't remain a holy grail for very long if it's something that's affordable. I think part of the fun in watchmaking is that we can't afford everything, right? There are art pieces and master watchmakers producing things that are so impressive that we can enjoy without having to own. Just the fact that somebody is producing it and keeping that alive. Things like grand complications that might be $600,000 or maybe $1 million. I don't ever need to own one. And I don't think I ever will be able to afford one. But that doesn't mean I can't enjoy it and enjoy the story of it, enjoy the engineering, and enjoy the fact that there are people who get to work on watches like those. Because there are people who can afford them. And if there weren't people who could afford them, we might lose the knowledge to be able to make something like a grand complication. When you're developing a new model, how do you balance staying true to your heritage or brand image while innovating for a modern audience? It's a very good question. I think a lot of it has to do with making what I enjoy, because the brand is really just a part of me. It's an extension of my personality. And so I try to focus on the things that I like, and usually they align with our brand. As a brand grows and involves more people, that could get complicated. And as there's more input from outside influences, right, you could lose sight of your original voice or your original image. So all the input I receive, I always internalize it and then see if any of that actually works with what I'm interested in and what I hope that the Weiss brand will be. What is the hardest technical thing about designing mechanical watches? I think one of the hardest technical aspects of designing mechanical watches is just that they are so tiny and there are so many important dimensions that when we have to come up with tolerances for some of those parts, figuring out what will work and what will not work, that can be challenging. And when you make something in your own workshop, you don't necessarily have to be as perfect with your documentation and your tolerances. But if we want to be able to grow and have the option that if our machine maybe breaks down and we need to send a part to another machine shop, we have to make sure that our technical documentation is perfect. It's the roadmap to success for a machinist to be able to make a part that we will get, and not only will it be able to be polished and perfected so that it'll go on a wristwatch, but it needs to work. And if we don't know at what point that part stops to work, and we don't give that information successfully to the machinist, then we can't really fault them if something doesn't work. It's our fault for not having the right documentation. And a lot of people overlook that. Would you ever be open to writing a book? I am certainly open to writing a book. I've actually started working on a book. So maybe in the future, you'll hear an announcement here about a new book. Have you ever considered making a watch case out of solid brass? I have thought about it, but the one thing that holds me back from doing that is that brass on the exterior of a watch, as soon as you make it, it starts to change. And the whole goal with making a mechanical wristwatch is that it should remain unchanged, or it should get better with age, right? And my feeling about a brass case for a watch is that it doesn't change for the better. To me, it would be like using a piece of iron for the exterior of a watch that would rust and turn red. I don't think that I would want to have that on my wrist. I much prefer a stainless steel that will wear and it will get nicks and dents, but it won't have corrosion that could lead to other problems. And I think that's the one drawback with a brass or a bronze watch case, is that we would have to add some sort of coating on top of that so that it doesn't immediately corrode. How far away are you from a fully Weiss-made movement? I've never had any intention to manufacture wire springs like hairsprings or mainsprings, and I've also had no intentions to produce any sapphire components like jewels or sapphire crystals. Other than that, anything metal inside of a watch that we can machine, that's the focus. Screws, main plates, bridges, wheels, pinions, levers, these are all parts that we can machine right here in this workshop. So we're there. We can make almost every watch part, including a balance wheel and a balance staff and an escape wheel. The only thing I don't foresee us producing here is going to be those wire springs and the sapphire components. What other complications do you have plans to make, and what would your first complication of choice be? I like chronographs and GMTs. Chronographs because of the history and the complexity behind the making of them, and GMTs because I actually find them useful. Those would be the direction that I would take if I was to produce a complication in the Weiss workshop. Thank you for all the support over the last 2 years. You all are the reason that we make these episodes. So it's really nice to see all the questions. I have a lot of fun reading them and thinking about them, because some of this I don't get to think about on a regular basis, and it's fun to do these Q&As. Make sure you subscribe and stay tuned, because we have some new things coming up this year that I think will be very exciting.